Grizzly bears embody raw strength and untamed instinct, commanding both fear and admiration. Despite their often solitary nature, a sudden encounter can ignite their fierce defensive instincts, leading to swift and violent attacks. These moments are rarely provoked by malice. Rather, they are driven by surprise, protection of the young, or territorial defense. A grizzly's charge is a blur of power, leaving little time for reaction. To survive such encounters, understanding their signals and respecting their boundaries is not just wise, it's essential. In the harsh wilderness of a national park and preserve in south-central Alaska in 1997, where civilization barely clung to the edges of an untamed frontier, Elijah Montgomery Boone made his solitary way through life. The region had long been known for its unforgiving terrain and even more unforgiving wildlife. Still, recent years had brought tales of something that struck fear into even the most hardened frontiersmen. The national park and preserve in south-central Alaska had been home to native Otna people for centuries, before Russian fur traders arrived in the late 1700s, followed by American prospectors during the gold rush. The collision of these worlds had created an uneasy balance between humanity and wilderness, with small settlements scattered throughout valleys where towering mountains cast long shadows over those brave enough to call this place home. Elijah carried with him an ancient .45 .70 Springfield rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth from the hands of generations before him. The weapon had been his grandfather's during the Civil War, passed to his father, and finally to him, a family heirloom that had seen more history than most history books. The rifle's brass fittings had dulled with age, and the barrel bore microscopic scars from decades of use. But in Elijah's hands, it remained as reliable as the day it was forged. Throughout that bitter winter, stories had spread about a monstrous grizzly that locals had begun calling the Wrangell Devil. Standing reportedly over 12 feet tall when on its hind legs, this particular bear had become the stuff of nightmares. 3 trappers had gone missing in November. In December, a hunting party found their camp torn to pieces, with tracks larger than dinner plates leading away into the forest. By January, the beast had grown bold enough to raid homesteads on the outskirts of settlements, leaving destruction and occasionally blood in its wake. Game wardens and professional hunters had tracked the creature, but none had managed to corner it. Some claimed it possessed an almost supernatural intelligence, always one step ahead of those who sought it. Others, more pragmatic, suggested it was simply an unusually large male that had learned humans were easy prey. On February 18th, as a vicious snowstorm descended upon the region, word reached the small trading post where Elijah had stopped for supplies that the Hargrove family, Thaddeus, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 young children, were trapped in their small sod house 10 miles north. The monstrous bear had been sighted circling their property since dawn, and their nearest neighbor had ridden through the brewing storm to seek help. No one volunteered to brave the blizzard, except Elijah Boone. The journey through the storm nearly killed him before he ever laid eyes on the beast. Snow whipped horizontally across the landscape, reducing visibility to just a few feet. His horse refused to continue halfway there, forcing Elijah to continue on foot, the faithful Springfield clutched in his gloved hands. By the time he spotted the smoke from the Hargrove chimney, his beard had frozen solid against his face, and he could no longer feel his toes. The bear's tracks around the property told a chilling story. It had circled repeatedly, testing doors and the single small window, looking for weakness. Inside, Thaddeus Hargrove had positioned his family in the center of the one-room dwelling, his hunting rifle aimed at the door that groaned under occasional powerful blows. Elijah announced his presence with a warning shot that cracked through the howling wind. The massive grizzly, which had been pawing at the rear wall of the sod house, turned toward the sound. Even hunched against the storm, its shoulders stood higher than a tall man's head. Its fur, dark brown and matted with ice, moved like a living shadow against the white backdrop of swirling snow. Most disturbing were its eyes, amber orbs that reflected not fear but calculation. The distance between them closed with shocking speed. Elijah raised his rifle and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. The firing pin had frozen. Working furiously with numbed fingers, he cleared the mechanism and fired again as the bear charged. The bullet grazed its massive shoulder, tearing a chunk of flesh but doing nothing to slow its advance. 15 feet, 10 feet. Elijah managed to chamber another round as the grizzly rose to its full, terrifying height. The Springfield roared a third time just as the bear's massive paw swept toward him. This time, the heavy lead slug found its mark, entering through the bear's left eye and driving upward into its brain. The force of the dying animal's momentum carried it forward, crashing into Elijah. Its claws raked across his arms and chest as they tumbled together into the snow. For one terrible moment, the frontiersman thought he would be crushed under the enormous weight. Then the bear shuddered once and went still. 3 days later, Elijah Boone staggered back into the trading post, his clothes torn and frozen with blood, both his and the bear's. His face bore new lines that hadn't been there before, and his left arm hung in a crude sling made from his shirt. The wounds across his chest would leave scars that he would carry to his grave many years later. The Hargrove family survived to tell the tale, though Elijah himself rarely spoke of that day. When pressed by newcomers to the region, he would simply shake his head and turn his attention to cleaning the old Springfield that never left his side. The bear's skull, displayed in the trading post for years afterward, measured larger than any previously recorded in North America. In time, the story of Elijah Montgomery Boone and the Wrangell Devil became part of Alaskan frontier lore, whispered around campfires as a reminder that in such wild places, the line between predator and prey could shift in an instant. The old Springfield rifle eventually found its way to a small museum in Fairbanks, where a faded card noted its role in bringing down what might have been the largest grizzly bear in recorded history, and saving the lives of 4 people who would otherwise have been lost to the wilderness on that frigid February day. The isolated shores of Kodiak Island, Alaska, in 1978, were shrouded in mist as Harlan Mercer and Dexter Calloway unloaded their gear from a small float plane. Kodiak Island had long been legendary among hunters for hosting the largest subspecies of brown bears in the world, with males frequently weighing over 1,500 pounds. The island's rugged terrain, spanning nearly 3,600 square miles of dense forest and open tundra, had remained largely untouched by modern development. The 2 men had been hunting partners for over 20 years, having met during military service and bonding over their shared passion for tracking North America's most formidable game. Now in their early 50s, they considered themselves seasoned veterans of the wilderness. Harlan, a retired forestry ranger from Montana, had previously harvested 2 Kodiak bears. Dexter, who ran a successful sporting goods store in Colorado, had accompanied Harlan on numerous adventures but had never taken a Kodiak himself. Their guide, Alexander Petrov, a third-generation Russian-American whose grandfather had settled in Alaska before it became a state, had warned them that late October was pushing the season. Most hunters came in spring or early fall, he explained, but Dexter had insisted on this trip, driven by a lifelong dream to claim a trophy Kodiak before his upcoming surgery for early-stage cancer. For 3 days, the men tracked through difficult terrain, sighting several bears, but none that met their ambitions. On the 4th morning, as they hiked along a salmon stream swollen from recent rain, Alexander froze, pointing silently toward movement on the opposite bank. Through their binoculars, they spotted what they had come for, a massive male Kodiak, perhaps 10 feet tall on its hind legs, feeding voraciously on late-season salmon. The bear's enormous frame moved with surprising grace as it plucked fish from the rushing water. Its coat, dark brown with silver-tipped guard hairs, glistened in the weak sunlight. Alexander whispered a warning about the wind direction, but Dexter was already moving into position, eager to secure his trophy. Harlan followed cautiously, concerned about his friend's impatience. The shot echoed through the valley, followed by an eerie silence. The bear stumbled, roaring in pain and confusion, but remained standing. Dexter had rushed the shot, hitting the bear too low and too far back, a grievous wound but not immediately fatal. Alexander cursed under his breath as the wounded animal turned toward the source of its agony. What happened next occurred with devastating speed. The enraged Kodiak crashed through the shallow stream, covering ground with shocking agility despite its massive size. Dexter frantically worked to chamber another round, his cold fingers fumbling with the bolt action. Harlan raised his rifle but hesitated, fearful of hitting his friend who stood between him and the charging bear. Alexander shouted a warning, but it came too late. The bear was upon Dexter in seconds, knocking him to the ground with a single swipe of its massive paw. The impact alone would have been enough to cause serious injury, but the bear's rage demanded more. Its jaws closed around Dexter's upper body with bone-crushing force. Harlan fired repeatedly, his shots going wide in his panic. Alexander finally managed a clean shot to the bear's shoulder, but the wounded animal, now driven by pure survival instinct, released Dexter only to charge toward the remaining hunters. Harlan turned and ran, crashing through underbrush and over fallen logs, his gear abandoned in his desperate flight. Alexander stood his ground for another moment, firing once more before the bear was upon him. His scream was brief. 3 days later, when the scheduled pickup plane arrived, there was no sign of the hunting party at the rendezvous point. The pilot radioed for a search and rescue team, and one came the following morning. They found Harlan huddled in a makeshift shelter 5 miles from the attack site, delirious with exposure and traumatized beyond coherent speech. The search team eventually located what remained of the campsite and, following a trail of disturbed ground and blood, the grim evidence of what had transpired. Dexter's body was recovered, though Alexander's was never found. The bear itself was discovered 2 miles away, having finally succumbed to its wounds. In the aftermath, Harlan Mercer never fully recovered from the psychological impact of that day. He refused all interviews and eventually moved to a small town in New Mexico, as far from bear country as he could manage. Local guides on Kodiak Island added the incident to their cautionary tales about the dangers of wounded bears, particularly the island's namesake giants. Wildlife officials who examined the bear carcass estimated it had weighed nearly 1,600 pounds and stood over 10 feet tall on its hind legs, one of the largest specimens documented in decades. The investigation concluded that a combination of factors had contributed to the tragedy: a poorly placed shot, inadequate firepower for an immediate follow-up, and perhaps most critically, underestimating the speed and ferocity with which a wounded Kodiak could react. Years later, a wildlife photography team filming a documentary about Kodiak bears would interview one of the search and rescue team members who had found Harlan. The rescuer recounted how the survivor had repeated one phrase over and over during the airlift to safety: "You don't get a second chance." It became something of a somber motto among Kodiak guides, a reminder that in encounters with the island's mighty bears, mistakes were rarely survivable. The incident prompted changes to hunter education programs specific to Kodiak bears, emphasizing the importance of proper shot placement and the need for adequate firepower. Alexander's family established a memorial fund for guide safety training, ensuring that his legacy would help prevent similar tragedies. As for Dexter Calloway, his name joined the short but solemn list of those who had underestimated the raw power of North America's largest land predator. The dense forests of northern British Columbia in 2005 echoed with the mechanical growl of chainsaws as logging operations continued through the mild autumn. Among the crew working for Cascade Timber Company was Logan Prescott, a third-generation logger with 15 years of experience in the industry. The region, known locally as the Bear Highway due to its position between prime feeding grounds, had been logged systematically for decades, though large tracts remained pristine wilderness. British Columbia's forestry industry had evolved significantly since the early days of hand-sawn timber, but the dangers remained considerable. Modern equipment and safety protocols have reduced accidents. Still, nothing can fully mitigate the risks inherent to the profession, particularly unpredictable wildlife encounters that occur when human activity pushes deeper into remote territories. On October 12th, Logan was working a section approximately 2 kilometers from the main crew, felling mature spruce trees that were destined for a pulp mill in Prince George's. The stand had been marked for selective cutting, requiring more precise work than clear-cutting operations. Logan preferred these assignments, finding satisfaction in the skill needed to drop trees in exactly the right position without damaging the surrounding forest. Unknown to Logan, the vibrations and noise from his chainsaw had attracted attention. A massive male grizzly, estimated later to weigh nearly 800 pounds, had been foraging in the area, fattening up before winter hibernation. The bear, agitated by the invasive sound and already territorial during the pre-denning period, moved toward the disturbance with deliberate purpose. Logan had just finished cutting through a substantial spruce, watching it fall precisely along his planned path, when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Before he could fully register the danger, the grizzly burst from the dense underbrush 20 yards away. covering the distance between them with frightening speed. The attack happened so quickly that Logan had no time to reach for the bear spray clipped to his work belt. The grizzly slammed into him with the force of a pickup truck, knocking him flat onto his back and sending his helmet flying. The chainsaw, which had been idling, flew from his grip and stalled against a fallen log several feet away. Pain exploded across Logan's body as the bear's claws raked through his heavy work jacket and into the flesh beneath. The grizzly's massive jaws clamped onto his shoulder, teeth piercing through muscle. Logan later described the sensation not as sharp pain, but as an overwhelming pressure, as though his entire upper body was being compressed in a vice. Through the haze of shock and adrenaline, Logan's survival instinct kicked in. Remembering his training, he curled into a protective position, covering his neck and head with his arms. The bear continued its assault, clawing at his back and tearing at his left leg. Each impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer tipped with razor blades. As the grizzly briefly released its grip to adjust its attack, Logan spotted his chainsaw lying just beyond arm's reach. In a desperate gamble, he lunged for the tool, fingers closing around the familiar handle. With strength born of pure survival instinct, he yanked the starter cord. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. The bear charged again, but Logan swung the running chainsaw in a wide arc from his position on the ground. The chain caught the grizzly across the face, cutting deep into its snout and jaw. The bear recoiled with a roar that seemed to shake the forest floor, blood streaming from its wounded face. For a moment that stretched like eternity. The injured bear and the injured man faced each other, both bleeding, both in shock. Then, with another guttural roar, the grizzly turned and retreated into the underbrush, leaving a trail of blood on fallen leaves and exposed roots. Logan's frantic calls for help through his radio were heard by Marcus Tanner, another logger working down the slope. Marcus arrived within minutes to find Logan conscious but severely injured, his clothing shredded and blood pooling beneath him. Using the emergency medical training required for all Cascade Timber employees, Marcus applied pressure bandages and called for immediate evacuation. The helicopter airlift arrived 40 minutes later, transporting Logan to a regional hospital. The medical team counted 17 separate lacerations requiring over 200 stitches, a broken collarbone, 3 cracked ribs, and significant muscle damage to his left shoulder and right thigh. Remarkably, no major arteries had been severed, likely saving his life. Conservation officers tracked the wounded bear the following day, finding it dead approximately 1 mile from the attack site. The necropsy confirmed it was an older male grizzly, estimated to be around 20 years old, with worn teeth and evidence of previous injuries consistent with territorial fights with other bears. Logan Prescott spent 7 weeks in the hospital and underwent 4 surgeries. Physical therapy continued for 18 months, and while he regained most function, certain movements would always be accompanied by pain. The scars, physical and psychological, remained prominent reminders of his encounter. 6 months after the attack, Logan returned to work with Cascade Timber, though he requested reassignment to equipment operation rather than groundwork. When asked why he returned at all, he simply stated that the forest had been his life for too long to abandon it now. His chainsaw, damaged but salvageable, was mounted on the wall of the company's main office, a testament to quick thinking in the face of nature's raw power. The remote town of Verkhoyansk, Siberia, 2012, stood as one of humanity's outposts against the vast wilderness that dominated Russia's Far East. Situated 3,000 miles east of Moscow, where winter temperatures routinely dropped below -60 degrees Fahrenheit, the settlement of just over 1,300 residents had survived for centuries in isolation and harsh conditions. Founded in 1638 as a Cossack outpost, Verkhoyansk had served as a place of exile during the Tsarist era, before evolving into a regional hub for indigenous Yakut people and Russian settlers. The town existed in a delicate balance with the surrounding wilderness. Brown bears, known locally as Kozen Taigi, or Master of the Taiga, were common in the forests that pressed against the town's borders. Residents understood the unwritten rules of coexistence: proper food storage, cautious behavior during foraging season, and maintaining respectful distance when bears were sighted near town. The winter of 2011 to 2012 had been particularly severe, with heavier snowfall than usual, and temperatures that remained dangerously low well into March. Wildlife experts would later theorize that these conditions had disrupted normal hibernation patterns and food availability, pushing desperate animals to take unusual risks. On the morning of April 3rd, Nadezhda Kuznetsova, a 54-year-old school administrator, left her small house on the eastern edge of town carrying several shopping bags. The day had dawned clear but cold, with spring still weeks away. Nadezhda had planned to catch the weekly bus to the regional center of Yakutsk, where she would visit her daughter and new grandchild. The town's bus station was little more than a covered shelter with wooden benches, located near the central square. By around 7:30 a.m., a small crowd had gathered, miners heading to work shifts, a few elderly residents traveling for medical appointments, and 3 teenage students bound for a regional academic competition. Among them was Mikhail Sokolov, a retired forestry worker who first noticed movement at the tree line across the road. The enormous brown bear that emerged from the forest moved with purpose rather than the hesitant behavior typical of bears entering human settlements. Later estimated to weigh over 700 pounds, the male bear appeared gaunt, its winter coat hanging loosely on its frame. Wildlife officials would later determine the animal was severely malnourished, having emerged from hibernation weeks earlier than normal with depleted fat reserves. Mikhail shouted a warning that sent most waiting passengers scattering toward the nearby municipal building. Nadezhda, weighed down by her bags and positioned furthest from safety, moved more slowly. The bear, perhaps triggered by the sudden movement or drawn by the scent of food in someone's luggage, charged directly toward the bus shelter. The distance between the forest edge and the bus station was covered in seconds. Nadezhda dropped her bags and attempted to back away, but the bear was upon her before she could turn to run. The first impact knocked her to the ground, and witnesses described the horrific sounds that followed as the bear attacked with the desperate fury of a starving predator. Mikhail Sokolov and Viktor Petrov, the town's deputy mayor who had been walking to his office, grabbed metal poles from a nearby construction site and rushed toward the attack. 3 other men joined them, shouting and striking at the bear with whatever implements they could find. The bear hesitated, still standing over Nadezhda's motionless form, before reluctantly retreating toward the forest, frequently turning to growl at the approaching men. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but Nadezhda Kuznetsova had suffered catastrophic injuries. Despite desperate efforts to stabilize her for transport to the regional hospital, she died at the scene, the first bear-related fatality in the region in over 15 years. The town's small police force, assisted by local hunters, tracked the bear through the forest. They found it 6 kilometers from town, still moving slowly, evidence of its weakened condition. The animal was humanely dispatched, and examination confirmed severe malnutrition and possible illness that had driven it to such uncharacteristic behavior. The tragedy cast a pall over Verkhoyansk. Nadezhda was well known and respected in the small community, having taught generations of local children before taking on an administrative position. Her funeral drew nearly the entire town population, despite bitter cold temperatures. In the aftermath, local authorities implemented new safety measures. The bus station was relocated further from the forest edge and enclosed within a secure structure. Warning systems were installed to alert residents of wildlife sightings near town. Educational programs emphasized proper response to bear encounters, though most residents had already learned these lessons through generations of living alongside the powerful predators. Mikhail Sokolov, interviewed months later by a regional newspaper, reflected on the changed atmosphere in Verkhoyansk. The town had always existed at nature's mercy, he explained, but the incident had reinforced the fragility of that relationship. Residents no longer viewed the forest edge with casual familiarity, but with heightened awareness that the wilderness was beautiful. However it might be, remained fundamentally wild, a place where human presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. A small memorial plaque was placed in the town square, bearing Nadezhda's name and a simple inscription in both Russian and Yakut. Remember always the line between our world and theirs. For the people of Verkhoyansk, no further explanation was necessary. The verdant foothills of a national park in Gatlinburg, Tennessee in 1993 provided a picturesque backdrop for what should have been a joyous family celebration. The Caldwell family had reserved a remote picnic area in Cades Cove, a scenic valley known for its historic settlements and abundant wildlife. The area, encompassing over 6,800 acres of rich valley land, had once been home to numerous pioneer families before becoming part of the national park in the 1930s. Now it serves as a popular destination for tourists seeking glimpses of the region's natural beauty and pastoral history. Charlotte Caldwell had organized the gathering to celebrate her son Theodore's 10th birthday. The family had deep roots in the region, with ancestors who had settled in East Tennessee before the Civil War. Though they now lived in Knoxville, they maintained a strong connection to these mountains, often spending weekends hiking their trails and camping under their ancient trees. 23 family members had gathered that afternoon: grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, spanning 3 generations. Folding tables groaned under the weight of traditional Southern fare: smoked ribs, fried chicken, cornbread, and Theodore's favorite chocolate cake with peanut butter frosting. The scent of rich food carried on the gentle May breeze, mingling with the smoke from the stone barbecue pit where Vernon Caldwell tended the last batch of ribs. Unknown to the celebrating family, these appealing aromas had caught the attention of the surrounding forest. A large male black bear, estimated to weigh around 350 pounds, had been following the scent trail for nearly an hour. The bear had likely encountered human food before, perhaps from improperly secured garbage or intentional feeding by park visitors, a practice strictly prohibited but difficult to eliminate. Park rangers had posted warning signs throughout the area about increased bear activity that spring. A late frost had damaged the natural berry crop, pushing bears to range farther in search of food. The Caldwells had noticed the signs upon arrival, but like many visitors familiar with the area, they had grown complacent about the potential danger. 13-year-old Abigail Caldwell first spotted the bear as it emerged from the tree line approximately 50 yards from the picnic area. Her excited shout drew the attention of the adults, who initially viewed the sighting as an unexpected birthday treat, an opportunity for photographs and a wilderness story to share with friends back home. Vernon attempted to shoo the animal away by clanging metal serving utensils together, expecting the bear to retreat as wild bears typically did. Instead, the bear lowered its head and charged directly toward the food-laden tables. The family's realization that this was not normal behavior came too late. Panic erupted as family members scattered in all directions. Vernon shouted for everyone to move toward the nearby cars. In the chaos, 26-year-old Miranda Caldwell, Theodore's aunt, stumbled over a tree root and fell heavily. The bear, seemingly confused by the sudden movement, veered toward her fallen form. With a swipe of its massive paw, the bear struck Miranda's shoulder and upper arm. The force of the blow spun her sideways and sent her tumbling several feet. The cracking sound of breaking bone was audible even over the family's shouts. Vernon and his brother-in-law, Philip Harrison, grabbed coolers and began throwing them toward the bear, hoping to distract it from Miranda. Theodore's grandfather, Walter Caldwell, advanced toward the animal with a camping chair held above his head, making himself appear larger while shouting continuously. The bear hesitated, torn between the easy meal on the tables and the threatening humans. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only seconds, it turned and lumbered back toward the forest edge, stopping occasionally to look back at the disrupted feast. Park rangers, alerted by another picnicker who had witnessed the commotion from a nearby area, arrived 15 minutes later. They found Miranda being attended to by her sister Elaine, a registered nurse who had fashioned a makeshift splint for the broken arm. Though in shock and considerable pain, Miranda remained conscious and was able to describe the attack. The medical report later confirmed a compound fracture of the humerus, extensive soft tissue damage, and severe bruising across her back and shoulder. Surgery in a medical center required the insertion of a metal plate and 6 screws to stabilize the shattered bone. Physical therapy continued for nearly a year, and while Miranda eventually regained most of her arm's function, certain movements still caused discomfort. Park officials tracked and identified the bear by its distinctive markings on its ears, confirming it was a known problem bear that had been previously relocated from another area of the park due to similar incidents. Given the direct attack on a human, the park policy required the animal to be euthanized. Tissue samples confirmed suspicions that the bear had become habituated to human food, with traces of processed items found in its digestive tract. The incident prompted the National Park Service to intensify its educational efforts regarding bear safety in the Smokies. New signage was installed throughout the park, and rangers increased personal contacts with visitors to emphasize proper food storage and appropriate behavior in bear country. For the Caldwell family, the birthday celebration became a sobering lesson in respecting the wilderness. They continued to visit the mountains they loved, but with heightened awareness of their status as guests in a wild landscape. Theodore's subsequent birthdays were celebrated in more developed areas of the park, and family members became unofficial ambassadors for bear safety, sharing their experience with fellow visitors they encountered on trails. Miranda Caldwell eventually became a volunteer educator with the park's wildlife program, using her experience to help others understand that wild animals, regardless of their apparent familiarity with humans, remain unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Her presentations to school groups often ended with a simple but profound message. These mountains belong to the bears long before they belong to us. We're just visiting their home. In 2008, the remote backcountry of a national forest in western Wyoming spans 3.4 million acres of pristine wilderness, offering solitude and challenge to those willing to venture beyond maintained trails. The forest, established in 1908, encompassed part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, one of the largest, intact temperate ecosystems on Earth, and home to significant populations of grizzly bears, which had slowly recovered from near extinction in the lower 48 states. Sarah Kimberly Weston, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist from Colorado, had extensive experience navigating such wilderness areas. Having spent her career studying predator-prey relationships in the Rocky Mountain region, Sarah possessed a deep understanding of bear behavior and appropriate safety protocols. She had completed multiple solo expeditions, meticulously planning routes and carrying proper equipment, including bear spray and a satellite emergency beacon. On June 12th, Sarah set out on what was meant to be a 5-day research excursion, planning to collect data on elk migration patterns in the forest's northwestern section. Her permit indicated her intended route, which would take her through several remote valleys rarely visited by recreational hikers. The weather forecast promised clear skies and mild temperatures, ideal conditions for early summer fieldwork. 3 days into her journey, Sarah followed a game trail through a dense stand of lodgepole pines. The narrow path wound through areas of poor visibility, with undergrowth pressing close on either side. Though she regularly made noise to alert wildlife to her presence, a standard precaution in grizzly country, the sound of a nearby stream likely masked her calls. As she rounded a sharp bend in the trail, Sarah suddenly found herself between a grizzly sow and her 2 yearling cubs. The mother bear, approximately 400 pounds of protective instinct, had been foraging with her offspring just off the trail. The encounter occurred at a distance of less than 20 yards, far too close for either human or bear to react comfortably. The sow immediately stood on her hind legs, a behavior meant better to assess the perceived threat rather than as direct aggression. Sarah, drawing on her training, avoided eye contact and spoke in calm, low tones, while slowly reaching for the bear spray canister attached to her belt. She knew that mother bears with cubs were responsible for the majority of defensive attacks, their protective instinct overwhelming natural caution. Whether triggered by Sarah's movement or simply the proximity to her young, the sow dropped to all fours and charged. Sarah later recalled that there was no roaring or other vocalization, just the terrifying sight of hundreds of pounds of muscle and fur closing the distance between them with shocking speed. She managed to deploy her bear spray partially, but a crosswind compromised the aerosol cloud. The bear barreled through the irritant, perhaps experiencing discomfort but not deterred from its protective mission. Sarah attempted to drop into a protective position, but the bear was upon her before she could fully comply with recommended protocol. The initial impact knocked her backward onto the ground. Sarah's backpack absorbed some of the force, but claws still tore through her right pant leg, lacerating the flesh beneath. As the bear straddled her prone form, Sarah instinctively thrust her aluminum trekking poles upward, jamming them against the animal's chest and neck. The unexpected resistance confused the grizzly. It backed off slightly, still huffing and popping its jaws, signs of extreme stress rather than predatory intent. Sarah maintained her defensive position, the trekking poles extended before her like a primitive spear. For several interminable seconds, human and bear remained locked in this standoff. Then, remarkably, the sow backed away further. perhaps satisfied that her cubs were no longer threatened or responding to the irritant effects of the partially deployed bear spray. She gathered her offspring with guttural vocalizations and retreated into the underbrush. The entire encounter, from first sighting to retreat, had lasted less than 90 seconds. Sarah remained motionless for several minutes, ensuring the bears had truly departed before assessing her injuries. The lacerations on her right leg, though painful and bleeding freely, had not damaged major blood vessels or tendons. Using her wilderness first aid training, she cleaned and bandaged the wounds as best she could before activating her emergency beacon. The decision to activate the device was not made lightly, as Sarah knew it would trigger a significant rescue response. However, the location of her injuries, their potential for infection, and the possibility that the bears might remain in the vicinity justified the call for assistance. A search and rescue helicopter team from the national park located her approximately 3 hours later. By this time, Sarah had managed to hobble nearly a mile back toward the main trail, despite her injuries. The flight medic who first reached her noted her remarkably calm demeanor and professionally executed first aid measures. At a medical center in Jackson, doctors treated 4 deep lacerations requiring a total of 38 stitches. Sarah was released after 24 hours of observation and a precautionary course of antibiotics. Wildlife officials interviewed her extensively about the encounter, commending her textbook response to the situation. Her detailed description helped them identify the bear as a known sow who had been previously documented with cubs in that drainage. No action was taken against the bear, as officials classified the incident as a defensive encounter rather than predatory behavior. Sarah herself was adamant that the animal had acted appropriately given the circumstances, placing responsibility for the unexpected meeting on herself despite her precautions. The experience did not diminish Sarah Weston's commitment to fieldwork. 6 months later, she returned to similar terrain, albeit with modified protocols based on her experience. She became an advocate for enhanced bear safety training among both field researchers and recreational users, frequently sharing her story during wilderness preparedness courses. When asked about the psychological impact of the attack, Sarah acknowledged occasional nightmares and a heightened startle response to unexpected movements in her peripheral vision. However, she maintained that the encounter had deepened rather than damaged her connection to wild places, reinforcing her belief that proper knowledge and respect were key to coexistence with large predators. She often concluded her presentations by saying that the wilderness did not belong to them. Rather, they belonged to it and could only enter on its terms. This philosophy, which was tested and affirmed through her close call, became the foundation of her continued work in the field. Her experiences reshaped her approach to nature conservation. She emphasized the importance of respect, patience, and deep listening when engaging with the natural world. No longer driven by conquest or exploration, her work focused on fostering harmony between humans and the environment. Through her research, education programs, and community outreach, she sought to inspire others to view the wilderness not as a challenge to overcome, but as a home to protect.